But so if we could turn to Council 24 August 2017, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, fourth item in supplementary agenda number 42, Southshore floodplain management short-term options. I should note that the Community Board wanted to make a deputation in relation to this, but on understanding that this was a deferral from last week's meeting. The time for deputations was last week, so I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that the Community Board has, you know, a very, very specific and direct interest in that. And since we've had the this paper before us, obviously they've taken the opportunity to consider some of the elements of the recommendations, which were actually slightly different from the recommendations that went to the Community Board for consideration prior to it coming to Council last week. But I've also been advised that, unfortunately, with a number of things that were happening with the Community Board, only 3 members of the Community Board were actually at that meeting at the time they considered this. I think Councillor Livingston went home unwell, and they said you went white as a sheet, actually, not green, but yeah. So I think that was unfortunate, given that both the chair was absent and the councillor was absent, so the 2 councillors. So what they've done is that they've worked with Councillor East in terms of, and I've been involved as well in terms of trying to rework some of the recommendations. I haven't had a chance to circulate those, but I've had a discussion with staff to see whether they are appropriate. So if you want to bring those recommendations up, because I'd really like to put these recommendations on the table so that okay, so essentially the first one is the same. We're receiving the report with the attachments. We are approving option 1, which reduce flooding risks in the areas identified, and proceeds with the area from Bridge Street to Beatty Street and South Shore as per the report. So it's what we would have considered last week. Can I just go through this, please? Essentially, it's the Bridge Street to Beatty Street and South Shore. So it's 2 of the areas. The one area is to be deferred on a very short-term basis. The proposed work in the South New Brighton Park, isn't it south of Beatty Street? Is it and or south? Is it just south of Beatty? Yes. Yeah. So so you don't need the and. South of Beatty Street, pending further investigation and discussion with staff, the Coastal Burwood Community Board, consultants, ECAN and other relevant entities to seek solutions which ensure that bund positioning and other measures, including soft engineering, maximise the opportunities to mitigate against coastal erosion in that area. The very specific reason for deferring that one from a decision today is to ensure, because there is a concern that with the positioning of the bund that we were considering, that the community might feel that we weren't interested in protecting the coastline against erosion, which is not the case. There are options around that could provide that protection, but when we're in that coastal environment, we're talking with ECAN because it is their responsibility in terms of the management of the coastal environment. So, and the coastal policy statement comes into effect as well. So we really want to do this properly, but also indicate to the community that we're not interested in just dealing with the flooding issue to the exclusion of the protection against coastal erosion, and it very much fits into our multi-hazards approach to natural hazards. And this came up last week very strongly in terms of the decision to affect the transfer on South Shore, South New Brighton and Brooklands residential red zone land to the council. again, there was a misunderstanding in the community that that this would mean that there was a difference in how we would approach the regeneration planning in the area, when ownership of the land makes no difference. So whether it's owned by LINZ or owned by the council, the Greater Christchurch Regeneration Act 2016 applies. And I certainly made that very clear in my statements, but what I found out after the meeting was that some of the community wanted to make a deputation last week, but they asked for that during the course of the meeting instead of notifying prior to the meeting that they wanted to make a deputation. And so that reinforced for me that the community is under a misapprehension as to the function of ownership when we're dealing with residential red zone land. So I want to make it absolutely clear that the agreed transfer to the council, effectively changing ownership, makes no difference to the obligations under the Greater Christchurch Regeneration Act, and that the council will continue working collaboratively on a long-term regeneration strategy for Southshore and South New Brighton with Regenerate Christchurch, which remains responsible for the development of any regeneration plan in the residential red zone if such a plan is required. So the law doesn't change from any decision that we make around ownership. I did think that I'd made that clear last week, but you know, the fact that I say it at a meeting doesn't actually mean that it gets communicated out from here. So we need to sort of ensure that we get that message through, and that's very clear. And then 5 and 6 are essentially what we had in the paper last week. Now 7 I think is important, and I think it's important for a number of reasons. If you could lift that up a bit. Yep, thank you. The reason why it's important is that this is an approach that I want to actually recommend to all community boards, and if councillors can just make a note of this. And as you know, Andrew and I have been meeting with individual councillors, and what's come up is a sense of frustration that an issue can be dealt with at the community board level, it can be dealt with at the council level, but there seems to be a lack of mechanism for actually bringing it to the community board's table unless there's a resolution that staff are reporting back on. So I really want us to think about utilising a monthly standing item approach so that individual community boards can actually put on their agendas issues that are relevant to their community board that they want to have regular updates on. Now that doesn't mean that staff have to produce a monthly report. It means that there is a standing item on the agenda so that there can be a reporting mechanism, or there can be a mechanism for the community to engage with the community board on a regular basis on issues that may or may not be concerning them. So in this one, we request the Coastal Burwood Community Board have a monthly standing item, regeneration strategy, South Shore and South New Brighton. So there is regular reporting to the board that also provides an opportunity for the community to engage if needed. And then finally, request that staff create a dedicated channel of communication, and that's leaving some options open because it may well be a page on the web page, or it might be a mechanism of a report through the community board. I'm leaving it open, but a dedicated channel of communication that provides advice to the affected communities on roles and responsibilities, with appropriate links to other sites, because Regenerate Christchurch, ECAN, the coastal environments, you know, the coastal policy statement, all of these things are relevant to the decision making in what is a complex environment. Timelines and milestones along with regular updates on progress. And I think, you know, I mean, I've been trying to find a mechanism for ensuring that communities have, you know, full access to information along the way. And I know that people are, you know, have been frustrated in areas, you know, that the flooding damage that's been caused by the earthquakes has been hugely significant. And I know that there's going to be some conversations and recommendations come round the Heathcote River area, and this is a mechanism for ensuring that well, there's more than one community board that has an interest in that river, and it may well be that a monthly standing item, and again a dedicated channel of communication, will enable people to feel fully engaged in the issues that arise out of there. So that to me is the set of recommendations that I would like us to consider and debate this morning. But obviously there's probably some questions that people would like to ask. We had a deputation last week, which is in relation to some of the damage that was caused in that environment, and the Ihutai Estuary Trust wanting to have some input in terms of the future of this area as well. There are a combination of interests, as it were, in a very complex environment. The option one doesn't take us into the environment where we're in opposition to other obligations in that area. The number 3 actually enables us to talk in a much more detailed way with the various interests and make sure that we look at those solutions that mitigate against coastal erosion as well. So, so rather than move and second these at the moment, I'll bring staff to the table and we'll direct questions to staff. If you'd like to come forward, thank you. Phil Dion.
Leon, I just wanted to say I'm having difficulty reading it. I can just read what's up there, but I can't see all of it, and I just wonder if there's another way of us
Could somebody see? Oh, it'll be published to the hub any minute.
Thank you.
Did you want staff to do a presentation?
Oh, staff are going to do a presentation first, right.
So thank you very much all for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to try and be very brief, but a few slides to work through, so obviously more questions. I wanted to start with a bit of a wider context about this project within the Land Drainage Recovery Program. We have a large program inside the Council's infrastructure program for addressing changes in flood risk resulting from the earthquakes. Sorry. So the Land Drainage Recovery Program is prioritised by flood risk primarily, along with other drivers. The progress inside the program has been significant to date. We've been progressing high priority stormwater drainage projects such as the Floodplain Street area and the Dudley Creek project and the Bells Creek project, for example. We've got a number of other projects in development that are going to come on stream, and those projects are now moving into these floodplain management topics for our major river stems, including the Heathcote, Avon and around the estuary. So in short, this report provides an opportunity to provide some interim or short-term relief to some of our affected residents before these long-term projects and plans can come to fruition. And those long-term projects are part of the discussion as part of the LTP. And inside the program, following those floodplain management projects will be medium and low priority projects within stormwater drainage areas. Now I'll just touch a wee bit on the Heathcote because that's of much importance to the community at the moment. We have within the Land Drainage Recovery Program prioritised a number of storage basins in the upstream catchment with the aim of reducing flood levels in the upper and mid Heathcote reaches. And there are, as illustrated by the flooding last month, significant issues related with frequent flooding, and we recognise those. And as part of that work, we're continuing to contact affected residents, and we're going to start another round of communication with them soon. And we have an options assessment underway for immediate, looking for options for immediate relief or short-term options for frequent flooding. And out of that work, we're planning on a round of engagement with the community in late October, as was discussed at the recent ITE meeting on the multi-asset project. So that's where the Heathcote is at, and we are working very hard for finding options in the Heathcote to help address some of those immediate concerns. So to move back to Southshore, this is some photographs that I took on Southshore on the 21st of July when I got out on site, and you can see that widespread flooding that was occurring during that event with overtopping of the estuary edge from the water level in the estuary. There were 2 houses flooded along Rocking Horse Road that council is aware of. We did a reasonably extensive door knocking exercise to try and understand the impacts of that flooding, but there was, as you can see in these photographs, significant flooding along roads and streets and access issues for residents. On the night we initiated some emergency works, and that included deploying pumps, engagement with local residents association, and building temporary bunds, and that is what you can see on the left-hand photograph here. And thinking around these bunds was already in development prior to that event in response to an earlier resolution from council to investigate options in this area and to address community concerns. Now, those community concerns extend beyond tidal inundation or tidal flooding, or the other term, coastal inundation, that's used, and include coastal erosion. Those 2 photographs on the right show some erosive processes that are underway in South New Brighton Park in the middle photograph, and on the right, further down the spit behind residential red zone land. And you can see in the middle photograph that significant amounts of erosion has occurred with time, presumably following the earthquake sequence, where those Reno mattresses, the hard engineering defences on that estuary edge, appear to have sunk, exposing the bank above to wind and wave action. Further to the south along the spit, there was a series of measures put in by private residents to arrest erosion on their own properties, and that's a real mix. There's a blend of vertical walls and hard fill, concrete blocks, depending on the approach taken by the individual resident at the time. Most of that work has been undertaken beyond or within Paper Road within council ownership, and is actually beyond the edge of the residential red zone per se, and is evident from even walking around that some of those ad hoc measures are not providing significant amounts of erosion protection. The soil behind those natural ground is moving away into the estuary. But I think there's opportunity here to separate the concepts of tidal inundation and coastal erosion. They are different processes and occur at different rates and in different places. And for example, we can mitigate to some degree tidal inundation risk through creation of earth embankments, much like the temporary works that were enacted, and that can be away from the top of the bank or the top of the estuary edge, where that common erosion processes work. Now, we do have to pay particular attention to risk of erosion of any sort of engineered bund that we might put in during a storm event. So there are sort of 2 types of erosion that we are very interested in. The first being at the edge, and that regular tidal effect on that edge and how that can be managed moving forward, but also the irregular effect that might occur if the bund itself were exposed to wave action during an extreme water level. And the risks posed to the residential land behind are quite different from each of those types of erosion events. And that's sort of the difference between long-term and short-term here for us inside the report that has been presented in the agenda. And this work that is proposed inside this report is intended to be temporary and short-term in nature, up to 20 years, have a longevity of up to 20 years. That doesn't mean it has to be there for 20 years. It could be modified, enhanced, or even removed if long-term planning processes identify alternative measures are preferable. So the idea is very much akin to what was proposed and adopted for the Avon River, whereby there are some immediate works we do in order to create some longevity in those existing Avon River stop banks, and allow those long-term processes to continue, and at the same time providing a level of surety for those who are offered some protection by those, or some reduced risk reduction by those measures. And you can see in the table above, I'm trying to highlight here that you can separate long-term and short-term measures, both for inundation and erosion. And that's particularly welcome for us in areas where there's some space between the estuary edge and the bund itself. That's not to say that we necessarily want to see the estuary edge move per se. It just opens up opportunities for softer engineering approaches rather than strictly hard engineering approaches. Where we have much less width, and I'll get into that a wee bit later, we are more inclined to move towards more hard engineering approaches. And it's fair to say that a long-term outcome for this area is like to include a real mix of all of those things, soft engineering and hard engineering, and it will be very site-specific. So inside this sort of framework up here, inside this table, you can see this long-term inundation options, permanent works, pump stations, managing earthquake effects and groundwater, and that is really what the OCEL report appeared to be driving at. And the OCEL report was put forward by the Local Residents Association, and we were asked to provide an initial feasibility assessment of it. And that initial feasibility assessment has concluded that this type of feature is really a long-term type approach. It is typical of a hard engineering approach. It requires considerable more consideration in establishing its feasibility in terms of earthquake resilience and groundwater management. And that's really a question for the long term, and it's very useful information for us and can help inform our existing studies that we have underway within that multi-hazard analysis. That multi-hazard project is looking to identify options for long-term flood risk remediation and floodplain management. And a hard engineering approach like this, what's proffered in the OCEL report, is an example of that, and so it is very useful for us to use in our investigations moving forward. But any of these options do sit inside a regulatory framework. And I'm just going to ask my colleague Debbie here to speak briefly around the regulatory framework that exists.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of the proposals outlined in the report, they are all located in the coastal environment, and this environment, I think it's recognised by many, has multiple values, particularly related to its cultural and natural aspects. And these values are recognised in the regulatory documents. So in particular, the ECAN Coastal Environment Plan recognises the estuary as a significant natural area. And that environment plan will apply to any works below mean high water springs tide. At this point in time, none of the proposals involving any of those works, so it means it may not apply, but we will confirm those things once we progress towards consenting. In terms of the Christchurch District Plan, the proposals traverse a number of zones, mainly related to open space and, of course, the specific purpose recovery zone, flatland recovery. And so, also as a result of
sorry, I'm not going to interrupt you, but I am. The flatland recovery zone, the special purpose zone, is what went in the district plan in the residential red zone areas only.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So there are a number of overlays that also apply to the area, recognising the various values. Specifically, there's a high flood hazard area. There's also flood management area. We've got sites of Ngāi Tahu cultural significance, we've got ecological significance, landscape and natural character. So there is a number of overlays, and not all of them recognise what's proposed in terms of flood mitigation. There's differences in how it provides for those within each area, and the upshot is that resource consent will be required as a result of one or more of those overlays or zones. So as a result of that, the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement will be relevant for any resource consent.
So needless to say, there are some issues that need to be addressed through a resource consenting process, or any consenting process for any option that is proposed. Here's just sort of a quick outline of some of those the options that are presented in the report. There's 3 options, and they're there to address the issues around erosion, inundation, and a third one, stormwater management. When we go and fill gaps in a bund, we also block overland flow paths, so we need to address all forms of flood risk, or particularly the effect of those works. So the proposed option includes items to address those 3 issues. There are 36 houses in the area which are below, or estimated to have floor levels below a level of 10.8. The level of 10.8 was met, or the flood level to about that level down Rocking Horse Road in places between sort of 10.7 and 10.8 during that frequent flood event. However, it wouldn't necessarily be sufficient volume of overtopping of the edge to get to 10.8 everywhere. So that 36 houses is likely to be an overestimate of the number of houses at risk. However, we've identified inside the report that we need to do further work around hydraulic modelling to understand the exact nature of that flood risk. So within the report, option 1, which was offered, and I recognise that what the revised resolutions today vary a little bit from this, and maybe I'll just describe that now. Option 1 was including all works between Bridge Street and further south, but essentially what was discussed earlier by the Mayor was removing that green section in the middle. Option 2 in the report is just stabilising the emergency works to the south, and option 3 is going as far north as Beatty Street, in accordance with the notice of motion that was resolved recently. So why do we need to go north of Ebbtide Street? Well, there are overland flow paths that exist behind the campground and could put at risk some of the low-lying properties along Estuary Road and further south. So extending the bund further north offers some risk reduction to those residential properties. And there is also other overland flow paths that exist further north. And in extending the bund right up to Bridge Street, we offer some interim and short-term protection to those residents to the north. And these proposals are consistent with the Parks Development Plan and also the master planning documentation for the parks in the area. You can see in this plan here there is a possible stop bank or shared use track identified with a sort of a green space and a red dashed line along it, which is away from the estuary edge. And also you can see in this plan the boat ramp and jetty that have been constructed recently or under construction. And between the two you can see some estuary walkway identified, which is roughly along the alignment of the existing walkway. So the proposed works inside the report are to extend the bund through this reach, also to stabilise the works further south. And this is some drone footage that was undertaken after the emergency works were completed. And you can see from this drone footage the areas further south, this is around Penguin Street, that there is very little room between the estuary edge and these emergency works. And in some places, particularly at the road ends, we are proposing to undertake more significant or harder type erosion measures. Now, in the further north, as I mentioned earlier, we're not the soft engineering approach is still an engineered approach. In these other areas, planting has great effect in reducing wave energy and offering risk reduction to these inundation measures, such that we can have greater security that during an event they don't wash away. Also, we have undertaken some elevation modelling of the emergency works that are undertaken, just to ensure that they meet the target levels that are present in the report of 11.2. So in summary, we have for those issues proposed a mix of erosion measures from soft engineering, monitoring and management of the edge. There might be some need to move some paths in some areas and localised planting. Of course, this will be subject to further work and further discussions with the community board, subject to the revised resolutions that have just been put forward. But also some more significant works at those street ends. For the inundation measures, it is proposed within the report to extend that bund right as far as northeast, as far as Bridge Street. But once again, that will be subject to the resolution that's been offered. In terms of that stormwater management, we are proposing to modify these emergency works to essentially cut a hole in them and put in stop logs so that we can manage the risk of overland flow paths and extreme rainfall events let some water out of the bund if that were to occur. Notionally, that stop logs would be left in place, but if we did find that we needed to get water out of there quickly and the tide was low enough, we could release that water. Along with this, we are proposing to improve our forecasting of these events and continue to work with Land Information New Zealand, Regenerate and Environment Canterbury. Now, the cost of the works have been estimated at this stage at around $2 million. We are still very early in the project life cycle. We brought this report to you with the urgency that was required by the earlier resolution. So the cost estimates at this stage are still, will go through further refinement and development as that design progresses, and hence the uncertainty that's applied on that slide there of the estimate of plus or minus 40%. Now, in terms of program, we have a significant dependency with the resource consenting that is currently being scoped and subject to what Debbie said earlier around the complexity of that regulatory environment and the nature of any consents as they might proceed from here. And this short-term measures are going to work in conjunction with the long-term work, planning work that's still which is underway. These short-term measures allow time for the long-term planning to proceed. The short-term measures do not address groundwater inundation, don't arrest groundwater beneath them, and the short-term measures are at risk potentially in a future earthquake if that were to occur. They're not built with earthquake resilience in mind. Now, given their short-term nature, the risk of failure of those measures is considered to be low. And that long-term planning, however, does need to consider those various risks, and that's why inside that multi-hazard project we are considering not only inundation and erosion, but earthquakes and the other tsunamis and the other hazards that are present to our low-lying coastal areas. So that is
and you have to get resource consent for the existing temporary works that have been done.
Absolutely. As the proposal includes retaining those features, and we need to address the environmental effects of those, and a retrospective resource consent will be required.
In terms of the land drainage recovery program, this wasn't the next priority on the list, but I'm assuming that because you're in the ground on the area and the initial works have been done as temporary works, that it's kind of you might as well continue with this element of the program while what's been done has been done, rather than to leave it incomplete.
Yes, it does present an opportunity for us to address some immediate concerns in the community and address some immediate flood risk. I would note that the estuary floodplain management project inside the program was prioritised after the Avon and the Heathcote, and that the infrastructure investment signalled within inside the program for those two rivers is significant. Yeah. We're talking about many millions of dollars, and that the timing of that would probably be out nearer the end of that 20-year horizon. Yeah. Subject, of course, to LTP processes and funding being approved or otherwise through.
And just in terms of the funding, so if we were to approve this and it came to the $2 million panned out as the ultimate cost, where would you propose that funding come from in terms of within the program?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the estuary has been identified inside the program as with significant potential investment in order to deliver the floodplain management plans that may arise. So it is programming that funding. Of course, that's all subject to the LTP process that's going on. So cognizant of that, we are proposing, if we deliver it in this financial year, would be to manage that $2 million inside the program. We had some preliminary design identified for those Avon River stock banks, which we can delay slightly and are still likely to meet our objectives in that work and coincide that with the long-term planning as that's going on and as the regeneration planning proceeds in the Otakaro River corridor. And also, if we try and spread the impact across a range of projects so that we can still progress generally within the program without a significant effect. I'd also note that in terms of $2 million, we have a significantly, it's a relatively small proportion of our budget for this financial year in total. It's still a lot of money. Yeah. Don't get me wrong at all, it's still a lot of money, but we have the ability to manage that within the program to minimise any sort of program risks on other projects.
Well, since I'm asking all the hard questions first, does this mean that there would be any delay to what is going to be proposed in the Heathcote River as a result?
The short answer is no. We have identified significant works already for the Heathcote inside this financial year. We already have a project team that's working very busily on that and will be reporting to the community in late October. Our ability to deliver those works, including those upstream basins, is going to be subject to further decisions from council. So we still have more processes underway to address the flood risks in those areas. And again, when we manage at a program level, we try and balance all the competing risks and opportunities that are presented in order to best meet the needs of our community.
Right, okay. So now, Dion, did you want to ask a question because you had your hand up before? So I'll go Dion, Sarah, Yanni, Glenn.
So my one question at the moment is, have we thought about the implications on the the Building Act stuff around giving the protection here? Does that have any implications on the height levels or anything like that for people who want to build in that area?
We've sought some preliminary advice from with regards to this, and we need to do some more work, but the initial advice is no, the building platform level set within the Building Act is above the height proposed for the bund, so the risk is still at that 50-year level with some climate change allowance within the Building Act is still greater than what the height of the bund, therefore it would still apply.
So what sort of more work do you need to do though?
Well, the initial advice was no, it won't affect it, and as the bund, the consideration is around the temporary nature of the bund and just absolutely ensuring that we have infrastructure. The nature of the infrastructure is relatively unique and might not have been considered within that framework. So in this area before, so the ramifications that are currently identified are thought to be very small, and the standard processes will still apply, and the floor levels and platform levels will be set as previous.
I think we just need to confirm that though. So
okay.
That's initial advice, and we'll confirm it as part of this process.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Sarah?
Thank you. And while we've had to do this work in the short term and protect those properties and the bunds and things, just recognising that this area wasn't prioritised, and I can understand that the Heathcote and Avon higher priority, but within each of these areas, so within the Heathcote and the Avon areas and then this one separately, would we normally within the land drainage recovery program be spending additional money to protect houses that actually haven't flooded? So currently this is proposed to, there are 2 properties that flooded to above floor level. And my understanding was that generally within the plan we prioritise properties where houses have flooded above the floor level. And there's an inconvenience with street flooding, but I mean, it's an extremely expensive way to get rid of all the flooding across the city on all streets. So in other areas like Heathcote, are we planning on protecting houses that haven't actually flooded?
Within the program, we take some considerable effort in hydraulic modelling to understand the flood risk from a range of sources. Now, any storm event is unique, and we can't rely solely on historical flooding to identify flood risk in areas, because the rainfall that might have occurred recently or that occurred during the occupation of any given resident won't be reflective of all the full spectrum of rainfall events that might occur and that flood risk that might be evident to that property. So we apply relatively rigorous computer modelling to establish flood risk at a property level, and we seek to corroborate that against recent flooding. So yes, absolutely, we consider areas of high risk and areas that have flooded, but we use that in addition to computer modelling to identify flood risk to private property, and that informs the program in conjunction. So we use both, and both are very important.
But we prioritise those areas where the houses actually have flooded, and then go, well, there are other properties that might in a future event, but they're less of a priority because they're not. And that seems to be where the stuff on Heathcote has been so far.
Except that, and you weren't here when we discussed the Flockton area, but there is no way that we only considered those that actually flooded as requiring potential protection, and you're talking about the potential under the flood models, which in this case are far greater than the ones that actually flooded on that particular occasion.
Correct. Well, as I alluded to earlier, we haven't had the opportunity within the time frame in producing this report to do that detailed hydraulic modelling, and it may yield a flood risk that is lower than 36 houses. I've got to be open with that. That 36 houses is what we call like a bathtub. If you just filled up that water up to that level, that is the number of houses that might be at risk, and we still need to do floor level survey and detailed modelling to quantify. But I think the modelling that has been undertaken to date has been coincidental with the observed flooding. So but we've got to look many years into the future as well, and we've got to consider that all of the city, and we haven't necessarily activated all had storm events in recent history or post-earthquake that have created or resulted in flooding in some areas where our models are predicting it. So within the program, we will come up with, there will be projects to address flood risk which hasn't yet eventuated since the earthquakes. It's been a relatively short period of time since the earthquakes in a hydrological sense. So the types of rainfall that has fallen hasn't necessarily been representative of all the different types of rainfall.
So how long would it take to do that sort of modelling and the surveying of those floor levels to see whether we were actually protecting 36 houses or actually many fewer? And should we be doing that before we commit to a large spend of money?
Well, I'd suggest that the do minimum option presented inside the report is to stabilise the emergency works, and it is that the work that is identified in that option is likely to be required through a resource consenting process regardless. So if we're seeking retrospective resource consenting and we want these bunds to stay there for 20 years, we're going to need to do some work. The additional spending in order to extend the bund further north could be subject to, will be subject to a later report. One of the resolutions proposed, or the recommendation that staff have offered, is to report back to council at a later date. The resolution does instruct us to pursue construction, but there will be an additional reporting between if issues arise, and we will be doing that hydraulic modelling and floor level assessment within that further work, and we will have an opportunity to report back to council if the views change.
So one of those issues that might arise might actually be you coming to us and saying, hey listen, our modelling shows that those properties aren't at risk when we thought they might be, and this work is actually not a priority.
There is a possibility of that. The floor level surveys will take some time to undertake. They require access to the property and a letter drop and all that, and significant amounts of work from the survey team to go out there and collect the data. The hydraulic modelling again will take some time, and we'll look to progress our design, subject to a decision today from council, in those areas. But again, if any with any infrastructure project inside the capital program, if there are significant issues that arise in development of those projects, we come back to council and report on those. And sometimes that is cost, and in this instance it might be the identified flood risk.
But, and part of the report back will also be the marginal difference between doing this now, when we have to do the retrospective consenting on the Southshore bit, and potentially stabilising in that area anyway. So there will be a marginal difference in terms of the work that's required to expand, given that we've already made some temporary stop bank decisions up the Bridge Street end.
Certainly.
Yeah. Yanni, Glenn, David, Phil.
Thank you for the presentation and the work that you've been doing. I know you've been working really hard on this issue. Just at a high level, in 2015, in November, we had a really good land drainage recovery program that showed a really cool schedule of all the different projects. Is there anything more recently that we have that shows us the status of the program? Because I'm sort of struggling to kind of find all the different things that we kind of agreed that we were going to do, but then kind of what's happened to each one.
Sure, well, we do report back through the Land Drainage Working Group on the program progress, and projects do report up through ITE, I understand, through monthly reporting. So on an individual project basis, we do offer that up through the standard council processes.
I just think it'd be really useful for the public and for us to get an overview of the program schedule, so that, like the questions that are being asked today, we can actually see here's the other ones that were planned, and for whatever reason they haven't happened or they're on track. And one particular I just wanted to ask about, because we've seen the money, we've done the emergency works here, and I appreciate this is to stabilise, but there were other areas that have been flooding quite badly where work's been I guess proposed, and whether there's any move to bring that forward as well. So just wanted to ask you about Bromley, and my understanding was that there was a Charlesworth drain that was going to be...
The staff are here to answer questions about this paper. No, I'm just going to say that there is a discussion with the community boards tomorrow, I think, with the Land Drainage Recovery Program Working Group. So I think that that's probably the best way through a reporting back from the group to the ITI to actually get that. Because I kind of would almost like to ask Pauline if she would take that on board in terms of getting an updated report to ITI on the actual whole program. I just think it would be useful.
The reason I ask it though is I'm reluctant to...
Feast. Yes, I know. I understand that, and that's why the recommendation that I've kind of worked on is to actually have a public facing reporting framework. Look, timeframes may change, you know, as this paper evidences. If it's an opportunity to do something because we're already in the ground and we're already applying for resource consents, you know, it's kind of, you might as well while you're still there. And that's a movable feast. But I think Yanni's point is a good one, in the sense that the wider public, and that's why I think that a standing item on more than one community board agenda might be the Heathcote River, you know, and then if Bromley's a particular area as well, that's also an estuary issue as well. There's a connection.
What I'm really trying to understand is we've had a whole bunch of adverse flooding events over the last 12 months, 2 years, and what I don't get any sense of is what work's being done, short-term emergency response work's being done to address all the areas that are flooded. We've got a lot of detail about South Shore, and what I'm concerned about is agreeing to commit...
That's the paper we're considering today,
Sorry,
Yanni.
can I just finish? What I'm concerned about is being asked to commit funding
the point
to a project without knowing what the other projects that are going to miss out in terms of the flood response?
They've already said that if it's to be paid for in this financial year, it will come from the Avon Stockbanks area of work, that it's on the program, but it's a long way out, so it's a bring forward as part of the LTP.
Sorry, but what I'm trying to understand, are there any other works that we should be doing as a short-term emergency or recovery response to the flooding that currently aren't funded that could be done if they were funded?
Yanni, the council asked staff to report back on this area. If staff had been asked to report back on a number of other areas, they would have done so. So I think that...
I'm happy to do a notice of motion, that's fine.
I don't think a notice of motion is helpful, but I'll talk to you about it on another occasion. Glenn.
Thank you. I've got two quite different questions. Just on option number 3, defer on a very short-term basis there for that area effectively in the middle. When you say very short-term, are you thinking weeks or months, or... It's a bit like how long's a piece of string, but have you got some kind of concept?
we were thinking just sort of several weeks, for maybe 4 to 6 weeks or something,
okay.
just to get some information back to us, so that we could actually consider...
Do it well.
Because I think the community are looking for comfort that the estuary edge is not going to be abandoned by the location of the bund. Is that a fair assessment of the feedback that we've had from the community?
Okay, all good.
I would just offer a word of caution there. Of course, we have, in order to get a report to council, there are periods of times, timeframes, deadlines we need to meet, and that does take some time. So I would suggest that certainly it might be more 6 to 8 weeks rather than 4 to 6.
Okay.
And probably I was thinking more that's where the community board comes in. So the 4 to 6 weeks to the community board, and then 6 to 8 weeks to the council. I mean, the time frames, I think this has to go through the community board. So it
does for ownership.
Yeah.
And my other one was just on the regulatory environment. It's resource consent dependent. You're talking about New Zealand coastal policy statement. So we're waiting for leadership from up high. That's basically what you're saying?
No, sorry.
You still haven't heard back.
So the New Zealand coastal policy statement is a high-level document that's already in place. So it was introduced. Sorry, that version is 2010. So that's the one that we have to give effect to in terms of any resource management documents.
Right.
So so in terms of national direction around natural hazards, that's something separate.
Although we're being asked to give effect to something that's prior to a significant event. You know, the 2011 quakes, which significantly altered the landscape of the area we're talking about. So.
Yeah, it's pretty high level, so it wouldn't go down to that degree of detail, but it's one of those higher order documents that has quite a strong legislative and regulatory basis. So, I mean, the consenting environment in there's obviously a whole lot of things that Debbie's referred to in her slide and that are identified within the report. So, whichever process you use, those will all be up for consideration. So, it's tricky with all the coastal hazards. Landscape overlays in there.
Okay. Yep.
David?
Thank you. Just a couple of questions around Southshore in relation to ongoing stormwater management and storm logs. There seems to be a degree of unsuitability in the design of some of the stormwater outlets, particularly the Ebbtide Street outlet, which is an area that does seem to be one of consistent flooding. And can you tell me what sort of process you may engage to ensure, firstly, that we have effective stormwater egress from these drains, which then may sort of prove that some of the stop logs may not be in fact necessary?
Yeah, unfortunately we can't insure anything with flooding. We just try and reduce the risk of flooding. There are things that occur during an event that are not necessarily unforeseeable, but might be uncontrollable. And one of those things is how the bed of the estuary might move during an event, and that can affect the operation of those outfalls.
Yeah, I think the questioning was more around the duckbill type of outlet there, and particularly the Ebbtide Street one seems to be silted up more often, and when it's cleared it quickly silts up again, and we're not getting effective drainage. So would we look to ensuring that those outlets are functioning properly first before we would consider stop logs?
So those, the duckbill valves generally are on maintenance cycle, so the City Keep do go out and inspect them, but you're right, it is a highly mobile bed of the estuary, and we are initiating some design work around that particular outfall to see if we can improve its performance. In addition to that, we have temporary pumping deployed when the flood levels are observed, so that we can over-pump that outlet in case it blocks. So we have both an operational response and a design response underway. Okay,
my second question is, it's my understanding that the OSAL report, and one of the reasons why it was so widely accepted by the Southshore residents was the fact that it actually embraced a range of treatments along that section of the coastline, from hard engineering, soft engineering to natural edge. Can you explain to me why you consider this typical of a hard engineering approach?
The figures that are offered within the report do indicate hard engineering faces, so rock revetment. Also the other features in, well, my interpretation of the report was it was more focused on that harder engineering style. The estuary edge treatment itself is obviously subject to some concern from the community, and in response to the resolution we'll seek to engage more with the community and do more work in that space.
So you would agree, though, that the report did offer a range of treatments?
The OSAL report? Well, what was presented in the diagrammatic form is far more towards the hard engineering style. The exact wording in the OSAL report I wouldn't like to offer explicit commentary on.
Okay, I just make the point that I think that there was a conscious effort to ensure in that report that a range of environments were considered in developing a solution for Southshore. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, and for a huge amount of work in this report. And I've got a number of questions. Just we know the number of houses that were flooded in Southshore. Do we know the number of houses that were flooded on the Heathcote River during the same event, same storm event?
So following the storm event, we did do an extensive door knocking exercise in both the Heathcote Rivers and in Southshore. And my understanding, I would have to confirm with my colleagues, is that numbers around between 13, I think it's 13 properties in the Heathcote. The original estimates were higher than that, around 17, I believe. So our latest figures are slightly lower than that initial estimate of 17. Again, we're going to continue to speak to those people about that event and gain an understanding of how the event occurred on their individual properties.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. There's been clear reference for further work needing to be done around this proposal, and just asking about the costs though. So the costs are $2 million plus or minus 40%. So in fact, if it stretches right out, the full cost of this plan could be 2.8 million. Is that correct?
As I mentioned in an earlier response, we will have an opportunity to report back to Council on the implementation program. and at that point we would seek to update the cost estimate. As I did mention earlier again, that we are very early in that sort of design life cycle, and so there are some uncertainties still in the cost estimates, and we'll seek to reduce that uncertainty in that further reporting.
Thanks, Tom. There's reference in the report that future decisions could mean that the bund would need to be moved or even abandoned. So I'm just clearly, in fact, is it correct then, could we take from that this short-term solution may well not be consistent, or it could be inconsistent with future long-term plans?
That is a risk that is identified in the report. That long-term planning is underway, and I wouldn't want to predetermine the outcome from that. It's going to involve a significant investigative effort, as identified in that multi-hazard paper that recently came to you, but also will involve discussions with the community and decisions from yourselves. So it is hard, I wouldn't want to predetermine the outcome of that process inside this decision here, and the intent is very much for these works to be temporary or short-term, so that we don't preclude options inside that long-term planning.
Yeah. And Tom, I've got a question, and Dion sort of referred to this before, but there's reference in the report for people perhaps, because of the short-term fix, if you like, that in fact that could impact on people's sort of view that in fact that will stay for a long term, that in fact it will give people some comfort, where in fact that may not be the case at all, that in fact this is just a short-term measure. So should we not have concern that in fact the short-term fix may well lead to some unrealistic expectations on the part of the community?
Again, within the report we identify that community perception is a risk with this decision, and however I'd like to say that the long-term planning is there for the community as well. We're seeking good outcomes from the community inside that long-term planning, and so it's my view that we'll seek to address all the issues inside that long-term planning, and if we're successful in doing so, then the nature of the short-term works, I hope, at that point becomes far less important.
Thanks, Tom. And I've got one final question, if I may, just around the regulatory framework which you referred to, Debbie. So can we take it that in fact this short-term option with the bund would actually meet the requirements of the coastal policy statement?
I think we'd need to do that work.
Yeah. So we don't know that yet. Okay.
It has to get a resource consent.
Yes, and so I also then wondered, would it, if we, as was referred to in our recommendations, asked to have this done by way of a regeneration plan, regeneration strategy, would the design still need to meet the coastal policy statement?
Yes.
I think none of the issues we've identified through the planning framework assessment go away just because you use a different piece of legislation. So they're there for a reason, because they identify issues that need to be considered as part of any process. So if we were to use some other type of process, we'd still need to consider all those issues. Our initial advice to you would be that a resource consent would be the preferable way forward. In terms of if you, the resolution is to go with option one or any of the options, they will need a consent, and our advice to you is that would be the best way forward to enable it to occur.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks. Tim.
Thank you. I just first of all want to acknowledge Keith, you and your team, Tom, Peter, etc. It's really frustrating. You do so much work, and it's like an iceberg. You have to do that work underneath, because without that, the top bit, that is the finishing bit, is a waste of time if it's not done properly. So I just want to acknowledge that and my respect for you. My question is actually to Carleen. Because we're being live streamed and many of the Heath could be watching this, and I know we're talking about South Shore, And I totally understand the reasoning for this, because we're there now, we've done a bit of work, it just seems logical. The same with Flockton, but the people that I'm dealing with in Heathcote, my constituents and others outside that, and I know that my colleagues, because the Heathcote runs from Ferrymead right up to areas along Hernhay Road and areas that you wouldn't even know are being flooded if you weren't affected by it. So in the annual, and I know it's a bit long-winded, but we'll just go with it. With the annual plan, councillors, we wanted to keep it 5.5 with rates. And we have a finite amount of money, so we ebb and flow to try and make that happen. So my question, I guess, is the executive leadership team and yourself aware that when we come to the long-term plan, that this will be a priority for many, which will then maybe affect cuts to other programs like roading and others? I'm just putting a heads up, because it certainly is for me.
We're very aware of the challenges in terms of keeping rates at an affordable level. And increasing rates at an affordable level, but with the huge volume of work that we have to do. So it's not only business as usual, there's recovery from, continuing recovery from the earthquakes. There's new things that community look for as well as these longer term issues around land drainage, flood prevention. And actually that will be the decision for council in terms of how you prioritise those things. So we'll be providing you with scenarios. But that will be the real challenge in terms of, do you invest up front and get some of these things done more quickly, but that will mean an increase in rates, or do you take longer to address some of these issues?
Well, and that's probably the thing to my question. It may not, because if we as councillors, because I can only talk to myself, I'm going to be very clear about my priorities, and so if there is a Trojan horse like funding from the NZTA for a new road, which 50-50 or whatever, I will have to look at myself very hard and say, can I support that? Because if I want to keep, if the ratepayers want to keep rates at a certain level, and there are many that are not affected by flooding, but how do we do that? I guess I'm just sending a signal to, are you and your ELT aware that that may be one of the questions and one of those hard calls that we have to make? Because with the fires, it's very simple in the sense that it was life risk, private property, and then everything else. It seems that we are focused, but it ebbs and flows a bit. I'm just
appropriate.
I know it shouldn't. I'll try for something else there.
We're absolutely aware, and these will be really challenging decisions that council will need to make once it's got all the information.
Yeah, because I asked that question because those in the there's totally logic why we did Flockton, no question about that. It seems logical why we're looking at this now, but dealing with those families and those, it is very, very hard, and we have to make a move on this. It has been left too long. Thank you.
And one of the just sort of following on from Carleen, one of the pieces of work that is being worked up within the organisation and within my office is to and I've been calling it the Earthquake 8 by Homework, but it's really a statement of where we are, because I still don't think the public quite realise how much more horizontal infrastructure needs to be done. The recommendation of the independent hearings panel that we enter into a cost sharing agreement with central government on land drainage. So, the fact that the roads and the pipes were covered by the cost sharing agreement has actually left a gap in terms of the earthquake related damage in terms of the land drainage recovery program. So that's something that's obviously on hold until after certain event on the 23rd of September, but it is something that we will be talking to the incoming government regardless of who that is. And it is absolutely vital that people understand that there are enormous costs lying ahead of us in terms of the whole program, and some of them are absolutely attributable to the level of the earthquake damage that was that occurred.
It may come to a point that we have to look at and split it in half, as in water quality, as in because all those laterals that split, and the minimising, if possible, the elimination of flooding. So the two things. So let's get the flooding sorted and then the water quality, and maybe that's a discussion that we have to have in the future.
Yeah, and when we've set our strategic priorities, and the work that will entail also dubs into the requirement to get the whole system up and running as best we can. Yeah. Mike, Sarah. Oh, sorry, Mike, Pauline, Sarah.
Thank you. Just want to get a few things straight. So it's obviously the flooding on the 21st of July was caused by a combination of events. So you could say the perfect storm. I think it saw records the highest in 43 years in some areas, and 2 properties, 2 homes were flooded, one temporary, one permanent. And the emergency works done would actually now protect those 2 properties from that type of flood?
The word protection is something we try and move away from. We've reduced the risk of flooding of those properties, of above floor flooding. That said, the subsequent tide had a very similar water level to that on the 22nd, had a very similar water level to that on the 21st, and that was with a different combination of air pressure, wind and wave action. So essentially what we see is there are different factors that can combine to produce elevated water levels, and that we have identified that there is risk to properties in other places than just the 2 that flooded during that first tide cycle. And there are different storms that might occur to elevate water levels in the area. And so, like my response earlier around computer modelling, we need to look at the whole risk profile, not just what we've observed recently. And that's what's driven the recommendations inside the report, is our understanding of the flooding risk of overtopping of the estuary edge along that entire frontage. And in the report we're suggesting that the level of the proposed works is similar to that.
So the Mayoral Flood Task Force, how many properties in Southshore did they identify with vulnerability level 1?
I don't know the number off the top of my head. It was
I understand it was 2.
Yeah, a couple of properties in that order.
You know if they were the same properties, or because what I'm saying is we've obviously through that whole task force 2 were identified, and then 2 have been flooded in this recent event, which we could say is the perfect storm, and we've done emergency works that potentially could protect those or give them less risk from a similar event. And so we're planning potentially to spend up to $2.8 million if it does go out that far to protect an area, but potentially we could just do the bare minimum and actually stabilise what we've already done to protect the houses that are actually at most risk. So, there's been a couple of things I think identified that says, actually we're not too sure what the Building Act's impact is, and we're not too sure if the 36 properties is actually correct, because we haven't done modelling from the recent event, which appears to be one of the worst events they've had in recent times.
Yeah, I agree. There is uncertainty. There is uncertainty with every decision we make, but the stage with the project we're at, it's earlier than we'd normally seek a decision from council, but we're under urgency, and we want to get the right decision, absolutely. That 36 properties is something we'll continue to work on understanding that flood risk. My recollection of the 2 properties in the Mayoral Flood Task Force is that there are different 2. I'd have to confirm that, and we can bring that back to you if you'd like. And as I mentioned before, it is we're trying to address all components of tidal and rainfall flooding, and not all those combinations have occurred since the earthquake. So there may be risks that haven't been made evident since in the March 2014 event or in these recent events.
Pauline?
One was just a question about having to be tied to the ongoing maintenance of these temporary works if they're approved. Do we have any idea of those costs?
I haven't tried to establish the exact nature of those costs. The land in which the bund is placed is, well, through the park, is currently managed and maintained by council. I couldn't give you an exact figure on that, sorry.
Right, and does the option 1, does that include the stop logs?
Correct, so option 1, yes, yes it does.
So they will be needed to be operated during an event where we come in and remove those and install pumps?
It would very much depend on the nature of the storm event.
Yeah, but if it was a big one. Yeah.
Sure, if we had a very large rainfall event and not a significant estuary tidal event in the estuary, then you'd want to lift the stop logs and release that stormwater. If you had an extreme level in the estuary and above the stop log level, then you wouldn't want to open the stop logs, so you just let the estuary in, and that's when you pump over the top of it. So,
right, and so those pumps, are they temporary that we bring in during the event?
Yes, that is what was proposed.
Okay, thank you.
Sarah?
Thank you. I just want to check a couple of things on the current proposed resolutions. So number 3 is... Yeah. Number 3 is one very, very long sentence, which sometimes leads to lack of clarity. And I'm just looking at, it says here, which ensure that the bund positioning and other measures, including soft engineering, maximise opportunities to mitigate against coastal erosion in the area. There's a couple of things with that. Not quite sure whether that means that the other measures are actually the erosion protection measures themselves, like the plantings and those kind of things that we're looking at trialling to see how they impact on the erosion.
A bit unfair to staff, I wrote it,
so...
Sorry,
well, I thought it was in conjunction with staff.
What I meant about that was that bund positioning is only one element that that affects the potential for coastal erosion.
Yeah.
So it's both bund positioning and other measures, which may be planting, which may be, but it's making it very specific that we're talking about soft engineering as well.
Yep. So the other thing that's not completely clear is that when we say maximise the opportunities to mitigate against coastal erosion in that area, what it sounds like we're doing, and I'm mindful of the deputation we had from the Estuary Trust the other day,
which is
that we are prioritising erosion mitigation against environmental concerns, and we haven't had a conversation yet about what we're going to do in the area and whether that is the desired outcome.
No, but given that this is in the coastal environment, you know, that requires a consideration of ECAN. So, I mean, that is written to ensure that we are able to talk about what are the opportunities that we can take to mitigate against coastal erosion. What it's trying to do is to say to the community, by putting a bund there, that's not the end of the story. Right. We actually want to ensure that the coastline is protected, and obviously the naturalisation could go there as well as soft engineering. The reality is that there are plantings, there are mechanisms. I mean, we saw that wonderful presentation from Katrina Hill from San Francisco, who made it very clear that a graduated option actually can provide both protection against coastal erosion, actually depleting the strength of a storm as it hits, and it also has the advantage as it comes up, providing the flood protection as well. But nothing is an absolute. No. There is no absolute against coastal erosion. There's no absolute against flood risk as well.
And just checking with number 6 there, because it refers back to number 3.
As Houston will tell you right now.
Yes, absolutely. So that number 6 refers back to number 3. So just checking that means that any coastal erosion mitigation is going to come back to council for decision after options have been explored. Is that right?
Everything's coming back to council. Even passing option 1 does not put us in a position. It just enables staff to apply for the resource consent. Well, they'll bring all the work back here, won't you? Is that the idea?
Only if there's issues.
We have inside the report, I think it's paragraph 4.9, identified some additional work that we'd envisaged being required to confirm the design.
Yep.
And in doing so, if there were significant issues, we'd definitely bring those back to council and and you've asked us to bring back an implementation program. At the same time, it's logical to bring back a revised cost estimate if we're able to do so, if that has changed significantly from what we see today.
Yeah. But the actual money we have to sign off on the next occasion, not now.
I'd like to just confirm, could you please present resolution 1?
Of the
Sorry.
Approve option 1. Do you want to look at option 1?
Sorry, in resolution 2B, the wording is undertake the work identified to progress this option into construction.
Yeah.
If you sought an additional decision-making point, I'd suggest you report the progress into design, consenting and consultation, and that would trigger another report. Of course, if we trigger another report, there could be potential delays in doing so.
So that's the South Shore one, though.
Correct, but as
and instruct staff should be a separate sort of a paragraph underneath B, if you like.
Yeah.
Which applies to A and B.
Okay, so put do a couple of returns and then pull it over and instruct staff to undertake the work identified in the report to progress this option into design, consenting and implementation.
Last night, Leanne, your amendment probably didn't drag the
It's at the
hand across.
instruct level, isn't it?
No, it's
No,
and
that's under
instruct.
C.
So make an and instruct apply to the whole thing. So
That's a C.
So where it says and instruct, no, just do a return. Hit return twice at and. Oh yeah, no, that's fine. No, it's not a C. Pull it over. Yep. No. Hit return. Yep.
This comes 3.
That's fine. Leave it like that.
could I just get some clarity on what you mean by the word implementation?
Is it construction?
No, it's and construction, it should read.
Yeah.
What you've got, and construction, so just go delete, pull that up, yeah. Pull that up. No, just hit delete after construct. Oh, okay, yep, no, that's fine. And take out and implementation. No, sorry, and put back and, yep, and construction. Noting the need to report back on implementation timeframes and any issues under Resolution 6. Is that right?
Madam Chair, if the intent is to report back prior to getting into, or at that stage there, should approve option 1 read approve option 1 in principle?
Yeah. Approve option 1 in principle.
So you are seeking for staff to report back to you prior to building anything on cost and any other issues, and implementation program and any other issues that arise?
Well, given that the resource consent has to be applied for anyway, it probably doesn't affect the time frame at all. Because you can as soon as you've got the resource consent, so does it affect the timetable? Because will you be applying for resource consent?
We will need to apply for resource consent, retrospective resource consent for the emergency works.
You have to anyway, yeah.
That is my understanding.
But wouldn't you want to apply for the temporary, the strengthening of them anyway?
It is, well, I'll maybe defer to Debbie, are you able to?
Well, essentially the amount of work needed for the emergency works consent will be the same as what you need for the strengthening, so essentially it's probably a good idea to wrap them up together.
Roll them up. is the intention though that we report back prior to seeking resource consent? So
no, the way that I was kind of thinking that was for essentially this area, but particularly the South Shore area, that it was kind of like you might as well do the lot at once rather than have two resource consent processes. You have to, by law, apply for the retrospective consent anyway. So the question is can we wrap up in that the decision on South Shore, which is not then that's not an in-principle decision, but it's a decision to proceed to the resource consent for that as well. Yeah.
I just think, for me, it's just making sure that we know that that extended work is actually necessary before we commit to it.
Yeah, but that's the approval in principle. Yeah. So
I'm happy with the stabilising the current staff, retrospective consent, all that sort of stuff. It's just the knowing the, Yeah, but it's not all retrospective. We're actually asking to do that across there. So, so can we split them so that?
Yeah, might I suggest that the Southshore on the emergency works, the resolution could read approve into construction Southshore on emergency works.
Yeah.
That's essentially option 2, approving option 2, and then you're saying, in addition to option 2, you wish us to consider the works between Beatty Street and Bridge Street. However, you'd like us to report back prior to construction on any of the issues and benefits and costs of those works. And then you've also instructed us in that middle section to do some more work. So is it possible to approve option 2 in the report?
So rather than just do all that, I think that either we take a quick break. It might actually be a good idea if we just took a 10-minute break, and in that time we'll just get the final wording right. People can go and get themselves a cup of tea or coffee. I'll get somebody kind can get me a cup of coffee, and then we'll come back and debate the resolution.
I'll get a cup of coffee for the mayor.
You'll go and get a coffee.
Liam, maybe when we come back, but I'd quite like some clarification around future obligations of Lynn's, especially in relation to the financial part, because that's referred to in paragraphs 4 and 5.
But we don't know that. That's the whole point of it. There's no legal obligation for them at this stage, which is why I raised the whole question of the cost sharing discussion that we have to have. But Lynn's may be prepared, but in terms of their ownership, because they did do some work prior to the flooding event. Is that right?
Sarah. It was Sarah.
Did Lynn's do some work, or did Sarah do some work on that?
Well, my understanding is Lynn's operating or doing the red zone clearance and enacted some landscaping
they called it a landscaping feature, which is why we now have to get a resource consent.
So we basically don't know whether or not they would come forward with any funding.
No, and we've got to assume not, but certainly we're not giving up the ability to talk to central government in whatever shape or form it takes, whether it's Lynn's or someone else, that that there's a contribution in terms of the work that needs to be done. So you're not going to get an answer today on that. That's crystal clear in the paper, and it was last week as well. So, all right. So we'll just take a quick 10 minutes. So if people could be back here at 1:45, ready to go, and if staff could come up this end. challenging when we don't have, you know, sort of a lot of time to deal with some of these complexities. And it's interesting because I had hoped that this was the only item on the agenda today, so I think our time is going to be somewhat challenged for the other items on the agenda. So I might at some point have a consideration with the Chief Executive about what could actually be deferred until the next meeting. What consideration has led us to is that is one, to receive the Southshore Floodplain and Management Short-Term Options Report with attachments. Secondly, to approve option 2, to establish emergency works to construction. So it enables us to go ahead with basically the South Shore and that little bit around ebb tide, which have had emergency works done on them, and it's about stabilising those. So it's the retrospective resource consenting. They can get on with it, and they can deal with the sorry? Yeah, so they can go ahead with that. So that's agreeing to option 2. But then refer the remainder of the report to the next Coastal Burwood Community Board meeting, which I'm reliably informed is next Monday, for the board's comment, and request staff report back to the council meeting 28th of September 2017. Now that's not a community board meeting, so what I'm going to propose is that we actually invite the chair of the Coastal Burwood Community Board to present the community board's position on the balance of the options at the meeting itself, which she would have been able to do had it been a community board meeting that they were reporting back to. So, so would someone like to move that?
Yeah. I'm happy to move that. I'm just wondering about, we don't want to make the same mistake twice. Is the 28th of September date a realistic date for staff to come back to us? Can we?
But this, yeah, well, this would enable them to come back with a set of resolutions which we can consider on the day. But would you like to?
Correct. It would be my interpretation of that resolution that we would not be doing the design work for those other areas. We'd be talking with the community board how they thought best to address, or what options they might want to consider in that design work, and how they might see the resolutions being worded in such a way that would address their concerns.
So happy.
But will that have the extra information that people were asking for today about the properties that might or might not be at risk? You know, the 36, the potential overestimation of those kind of things.
They're not going to do the entire flood modelling.
No, so we're bringing back the extended potential. If the community board would like us to do the extension, then that would come back to us, but we still wouldn't have the information about whether it was necessary or not. We would just have the community board saying, please do it. That would be the extra information we'd have. We'd have the community board view.
No, and I think actually that's a little bit unfair in relation to the situation that we're confronted with here. And I don't think that it's, I think what we want in terms of the next set of recommendations, in a way I kind of want you to put to one side the recommendations that we're considering here today, because where we're working to is a recommendation that enables staff to progress design works and scope consenting and requirements. So we're not talking about the next step being approving construction. So the only one that we're approving for construction today is the option 2, and then we are asking staff to work with the community board to come up with with what they want to have considered in the design works and scoping consenting requirements. So it's not on the screen because that's what's going to come back after the community board has had a say about what they want considered, because from the previous recommendation that we were looking at, the issue around coastal erosion, where the bund is quite a distance from the coastline itself, is an issue to the community. So I'd much rather that they drilled into that issue and came back with a set of resolutions that we can work through. But the advantage is that we'll have an opportunity in that time frame to do another workshop so that we're very clear about what the issues are. I mean, I thought we were clear on the issues on Tuesday when we had an initial workshop on this matter, but you know, things have changed in a relatively short period of time, so that's why I'm thinking that this is a good outcome. Would someone like to second that? David? So that's moved by Pauline, seconded by David. Yep.
Are you still confident around the $1 million for the budget?
Hang on, we're not... Oh, you mean for the
Option
Southshore?
2.
Option 2.
Yes, I just want to be clear about how much money we're actually approving.
Again, in the report we've identified some plus or minus 40% on that, as with the other options, and again it is earlier in the design process. We still have more work to do, absolutely. Again, with any project within the construction, the physical works program, for council would come back and report to you if there's significant variance from any issues that arise. So if we found through the resource and consenting process that there were considerably more onerous requirements, for example, and we needed to spend considerably more money on landscape treatment, for example, then we'd have to come back and explain that outcome and seek further input.
Yeah. Phil?
I just want to check with staff if what we're doing with the third recommendation here about reporting with the Coastal Bilbao Community Board, if in fact that's going to delay any urgent future meetings with the residents on the Heathcote, which I know are planned. And I'm just where I'm coming from. I'm concerned that there's all this focus on these, whereas the earlier priorities.
Excuse me, that's not fair.
Well,
no, I'm sorry. It's not fair on staff to put that to them. We asked them to report by the end of the month. That's what we asked them to do. So it's a bit unrealistic and unfair to ask them what impact that has on a program which we know you're a member of the Land Drainage Recovery Program Working Group. They're meeting tomorrow to talk about Heathcote. So
I'm coming from a strategic point of view with respect, and I think my question is fair.
Well,
I can assure the councillors that we have essentially different teams working on those two issues, and they're both within the program but working independent of each other. We're not duplicating we have those parallel streams. They're working independently. A decision here today should not affect the outcome or progress on the Heathcote.
Thank you. Right, is there any debate?
Yeah,
Pauline?
Just very quickly, because we've spent a lot of time on this, I think this is a really good solution for today. It's an incredibly complex situation, and there is some conflicting information in the reports there, particularly where comparing this, this has been a very rushed process, and it's our fault because of what we called for it in response to an event, and this is understandable. But I think there's more work to be done on here, and particularly in the light that there is a risk that temporary works could impact on long-term solutions. There's also gaps in the information that may or may not be required. So councillors need a certain level of comfort about these gaps. So I think this is a very good solution for today, and I will be supporting it.
I think what's really important here is that we've had a number of flooding events and we've got the land drainage recovery program, but we need to get to a point where we actually change, because we're living in a dynamic environment. We've seen that with the weather, and we need to have a much better system of prioritising post-event from the learnings that we've understood from that event. And so, you know, I appreciate that these emergency works have been done in this area, and absolutely that was the right thing to do at the time. But it would be good to get a much more holistic approach to how we're spending money, which effectively is what this is asking us to do, and what the benefits are. And I understand that we'll have a chance to do that a little bit tomorrow, and then perhaps later on. I still think if you go back to the Merrill Task Force on flooding, there were a number of recommendations in there and it would be really good to get that updated, just so that we're really clear about what have we agreed to do as a council, so that the community can understand where our priorities are, and those priorities may change based on the events that we've had, and that would be fair enough. But we need to get some transparency over how we're prioritising our expenditure. So I think it is important to get these emergency works to construction. Ironically and sadly, this should have been done a long time ago with the whole relationship with Sarah and Lynn's. Obviously, we lost that opportunity, and I think it's important that we continue to try and talk to government. We've just done a cost share refresh, but you know, it's a real shame that land drainage hasn't been incorporated in that. Let's hope that we can get that sooner rather than later. The other point I just wanted to make is that you know, I think it's important as a council that we do just actually just take a very quick moment to reflect and extend our thoughts to the people of Houston and Texas for what they're going through. We often get emails around how Houston's great in terms of planning because it just has no planning controls and people can develop everywhere. And one of the really interesting things I think some of the scientists are now looking at is the lack of pervious surfaces and where does the water go. And that's actually an issue that we still face in Christchurch with all the development that we're allowing to occur. What is that doing to the flooding? And I know that the staff are working really hard on those bigger flooding models to understand that. But today, I think as we look at a response to a flooding event we've had, we should extend our thoughts and sympathies and anything else that we can to let the people of Texas and Houston know that we're thinking of them and that if there's anything that we can do, I'm sure that we would be asking central government or our chief executive to consider that, because some of you may know people in Houston. I've got family over there. I've received photos, and it's pretty horrendous what's going on. So thank you to the work staff are doing. Flooding's not easy. It's a difficult issue. I think this is a good interim solution, but I think we can't take our foot off the gas for those other solutions and priorities that we've got post the events that have happened.
Yeah. Thanks, Yanni. I think that's a really good point. Thank you. Glenn and then Phil.
Thank you. Yes, I support these recommendations. You know, obviously receiving the information. Number two, the establishing the emergency works, and number three. But in all this, I'd just like to say I don't want us to be divided over this. I mean, land drainage and flooding issues affect the whole city, and of course we're here as city councillors rather than ward, which is a tension not easily resolved when it's your own patch and you know naturally want to advocate for it, but all the wards are important. Something else I'd like to say is all 54 members, in my view, I think we need to really take seriously that role of interpreting climate change with our communities. It's not only Houston, it's Bangladesh, Nepal, India. Yeah. I attended the screening of An Inconvenient Sequel last week. Yeah. The scenes out of Miami, to be honest, are not too different to New Brighton. On a fine, clear day, the water coming up through the drains. Okay, so there are some hard realities we need to face, and we actually have a responsibility to step up. I've tried to do this. I've been politically burnt over it, but I think that the problem is we actually have to face these things, and it's hard to do, but the evidence is overwhelming. Mm-hmm. So we're a microcosm of what's happening globally. I think there's no escape from it.
Thank you. Phil.
Thank you. I'm happy to support these recommendations. I'm really glad that they've been reduced from the earlier ones. I think that it's important that as a council we continue to be strategic about how we do all of our land drainage. And the land drainage working program has been set up to do precisely that. And I just think it's really important that in fact we don't just listen to those who come to council with the loudest voice. There are, as has been indicated, huge numbers of people who've been flooded along the Heathcote, and in fact we need to make sure that our planning actually improves their situation, so we deal with that also as fast as possible, and I'm sure we can.
Thank you. David.
Thank you. Firstly, can I acknowledge the Mayor and her role in progressing this rather difficult subject and the amendment that we have before us today. In stark contrast to my tirade last week. I would now like to acknowledge the staff for their work, both in the emergency and ongoing with South Shore and South New Brighton. I'd also like to acknowledge the difficulty that we have in dealing with the many land drainage issues around the city, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to complete the emergency works that we have started in the South Shore area. Really, I've had a lot to say if we'd gone with the other recommendations, but I would like to say that the South New Brighton domain is a unique and special area in Christchurch, in the eastern suburbs and for the city as a whole. And it's a great asset, and we really as a community want to ensure that the best options are considered for South Brighton and ultimately for the city. We promote ourselves as a can-do council, and I see this remit here today as an opportunity for us to showcase a situation really where all the parties can come together and get the best outcome possible. What we are talking for this area, as I said a moment ago, when we look at prioritising things around the city, the investment here is not a huge amount of money, but I do appreciate that there are priority concerns, and I've readily acknowledged the issues and extremely supportive of measures that we need to take in the Heath catchment as well. So I thank everyone for their patience today and coming to what we have come to now, and I believe that we now do have the opportunity to sit back and reflect in a more measured sense an outcome that we can all agree upon. So I will have pleasure in voting for this resolution.
Thank you. So I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. That's carried. Thank you.